תודה. אני מצטער, אבל אני לדבר באנגלית. What I want to do relatively quickly is do two things. I want to give you a status report on what is one of the tasks of the Davidson Foundation project on pluralism in Israel. And then I want to talk about some of the big ideas behind the index. And of the two, it's probably, more important to talk about some of the big ideas. First question is why build an index? I mean, what is the use of that? And I think there are a number of answers, and probably the first one is the most important, because you and I can have arguments about pluralism in Israel for the next week, only to discover that we're really talking about very different things. We have different ideas and so on. So one of the advantages is it forces you to really think about what pluralism is and where you feel you need to have pluralism. The second is that it moves the conversation now from kind of grand ideas to some specifics. Actually create measures, ways of actually looking at the situation. And once you have measures, now we've got a baseline. Now we can begin to ask questions about in what direction is the nature of pluralism in Israel changing from the way it was in the previous year, and so on. As I will talk about at the very end, this also now allows us to talk meaningfully about different values that we attach to pluralism. And hopefully, if we are successful in building this tool, it actually gives a means for policy conversations and policy actions to take place. It's a very difficult problem to talk about pluralism anywhere. It's especially difficult in Israel. Pluralism, there is no such thing as pluralism. There are many different aspects to pluralism. It's fairly easy to look at societies and decide they're non-pluralistic. But when it comes to pluralism, there's a wide range that exists in different countries. And to take a phrase from Tolstoy and put it in this context, all non-pluralistic societies look the same. But every pluralistic society is pluralistic in its own way. This is one way an index of pluralism might look. If we use different dimensions, or if we looked at different times, maybe the countries would assort itself differently. So where does Israel fit within this span of pluralism? And the problem is even harder because in most countries you can talk about pluralism inside the borders of the country, relationship between citizens of the country. In Israel, you have this whole dimension that Israel exists at the heart of a larger Jewish world. There are people outside of Israel who are not citizens who feel a part of Israel. There are people inside of Israel who are citizens but are not part of the Jewish world. So this makes it very complex. Now, what Shmuel showed briefly was this first framework for our movement towards an index of pluralism in Israel. I don't expect you to be able to absorb this or understand it, so for the rest of the time, what I want to do is take you on a tour through it. We really start with the idea that we want to look at 4 different areas, 4 aspects of pluralism among Jewish groups in Israel. One is religion and culture. Well, that's a huge area right there. Education, civil society, and perceived minority rights. Now that seems a little bit odd if we're initially putting our focus on pluralism among Jewish streams, Jewish groups, Jewish communities inside of Israel. But if you look at the most recent Pew survey on opinion in Israel's society. They ask a question: how important is working for justice and equality in society? How important is it to what being Jewish means to you? And the number that said it was essential to their Jewish identity was not only, significant, but fairly consistent across these widely different groups. If we ask how many, considered it to be important or essential, then you see that a very large range of Jewish groups within Israel hold this to be an important part of their Jewish identity. So what we have done is, for each one of these areas, we've selected an initial set of indicators. For example, we would like to know what influence different Jewish groups have over Jewish institutions in Israel. Bringing in the culture dimension, to what extent is their presence in popular culture? And then there's the whole issue of attitudes, beliefs, opinions, and so on. What are the attitudes towards different Jewish groups? You see that each indicator has at least one measure, in some cases more, because some of these indicators are easier to measure by their nature than others. The measures that we use in that central block, they're really of three types. One are what we call assessments, because part of what we want to do is to be very open about the process. So these have a large amount of judgment attached to them, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. Then there are data series, things that you can get out of the annual yearbook of the Central Bureau for Statistics, and so on and so forth. And then results from the surveys. So I will show you how these also fit into the index. So let's look at this first one. And this is an assessment, level of accommodation of non-Orthodox at the Kotel. Well, an assessment by its nature, covers a number of different dimensions. This is why an aspect of judgment enters in. And we are trying to base them on expert opinion. We're looking at different surveys, and we're also looking at external information that may exist, either collected data, news stories, whatever. As Shmuel said, in each area we look at the degree of actual accommodation that there is in practice. We look at the degree of acceptance there may be, for example, of non-Orthodox practice at the Kotel. And we look for, what is the legal basis. And then we just very simply, for each one of those, we assign a value of 1, 2, or 3. 1 being the lowest, 3 being the highest. So, for example, level of accommodation of the non-Orthodox at the Kotel. Well, we cheated a little bit for accommodation. We gave it a score of 1.5, because 1 week non-Orthodox practice is not allowed. The next week the government announces that there will be a special area, and then the week after that, well, we're not so sure. So we were generous and we gave it a 1.5. In terms of acceptance, if you look at the surveys, and not just our own survey, you find that there's by no means wide or a majority acceptance that there should be non-Orthodox practice at the Kotel, but there is, acceptance of it. And similarly, when you look at the legal standing, this may be a little bit generous, but the idea is there is a ruling from the Bagatz, and the Mishtara are enforcing it, and so on and so forth. So if you just use this as an example, if you multiply those together, and believe me, you can, I won't get into the math of it, you get 6. 2 times 2 points 1.5. Well, 3 times 3 times 3 would be 27. That's the maximum. So we give it a score of 6 divided by 27, 0.22. And so it appears there. And for the other judgments that appear in this, in this area of religion and culture, this is the way it comes down. I won't go into these in detail in the interest of time. A second type of measure comes from information gathering. So here is one example. To what extent, is Mizrahi music present in Israeli society and Israeli culture, and how much has that changed? Well, here we looked at the data, and this was not easy. We had to call in all kinds of experts, girlfriends, and so on, ask this song, would you consider it to be Mizrahi, and so on. Again, an issue of judgment comes in. But if you do that, what you come up with is basically a number, a population-rated number of 0.81. And one of the nice things about using these types of data sources is it allows us to say, well, what has changed? So in the 1970s, the same measure would have given 0.06. Something has changed. How much weight we should give to it, how we should interpret it, I'll get to that in a moment. The last group are basically opinion that we draw from surveys, our own survey and others and so on. And here there's a bit of a problem. In the previous presentation, we showed you what some of the average opinion is about different issues. The difficulty is that we're not only interested in averages, we're also interested in the range of opinion. We're interested in the diversity. Again, we're talking about pluralism and the range of beliefs. So what I have done here is I've shown you 4 different distributions of opinion. They all look very different. The problem is that in each one, the average, the mean, is exactly equal to 2.5. Now, clearly there's information that we're missing if all we do is look at averages. This would be the average, kind of drawn right through the middle. We're interested also in the pattern as well. Now, I'm going to get into a little bit of statistics, but the idea is not to teach statistics. The idea is to pay attention to the ideas behind it. We want to track the average, but also the spread of opinion. So if we look at each one of these different series, the average is all the same. If we take something called the standard deviation, you see now there is a difference. The bigger the standard deviation, the wider the spread of opinion. The smaller the standard deviation, the more narrowly focused the opinion is, whatever it may be. And it turns out there's something called the correlation coefficient that contains both those ideas. For our measure, what we did is we took the correlation coefficient and we subtracted it from 1. And the reason we did that is now everything is kind of going in the direction that seems sensible. The higher this number means either the higher the average opinion or the more concentrated, more narrow the spread of opinion, or both. So if we do this, we see this, attitudes towards Israeli society. We did a further thing and we made soldiers, which were the highest ranking in our survey, equal to 1. So everything is relative to soldiers. So we see secular people at 0.89. One of the reasons that that's relatively high is that even if you look at responses from Haredim and so on, about 75% of those responses say the secular either make an important or a very important contribution to the state of Israel. Reform 0.65, Haredim 0.61, diaspora Jews 0.79. And so this now gives us the numbers for our first group. And this is what the completed preliminary index looks like. You can go through it at your leisure. Be very happy to talk with you about it. The question is, okay, so now what? What does this tell us? Because, how am I to understand something like, the state of civil marriage versus the attitudes towards shared Jewish or non-Jewish schools, towards whether there is adequate representation in Moatzot Datiot and so on. This is a problem of apples and oranges. So how do we combine them? And more to the point, what happens if somebody says, well, is Israel more pluralistic, less pluralistic? Does it accord to my definition of pluralism versus another definition of pluralism? So all we have done so far in our index is we've collected the apples and oranges, right? We've collected these different items. The attempt is to create a factual base, right? Now we get into the question of valuation. So one individual might say, well, I like apples, and I like them much better than I like oranges. So I see this basket that you've collected. I see there are 2 apples, that's good, 2 oranges, that's less good. I'll give this basket a score of 3. Someone else might say, you know what, I like oranges much better than I like apples. Matter of fact, I like them 3 times better. You have 2 oranges, I like that, I'll give it a 2. You have 2 apples, I'm not so interested in that. I'm going to give it only 1/3. So you come up with a different valuation for that basket. This is the way we want to proceed. Most of the indexes that you see produced don't tell you what goes on behind the curtain. They don't tell you what the weighting scheme is. We're going to tell you what the weighting scheme is. And more than that, we're not going to pick an individual weighting scheme. We're going to construct our work so that people with alternative conceptions of pluralism in Israel, who would assign different values to different aspects of what's in the index, would be able to make their own assessment. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.